Hello. Thank you for joining us on a snowy night. Those of you in the room I know are just incredible people who care deeply about this issue, and I'm humbled to be here with you. We are here on our new and noted series to hear from Pulitzer Prize finalist John Woodrow Cox with his important book, Children Under Fire, An American Crisis. Let's hear it for John. I'm Stephanie Flom, Executive Director of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, and on behalf of Pittsburgh Arts and Lectures, welcome. We are pleased to present John Woodrow Cox in partnership, the very special partner who does so much for our city and has many friends in the audience tonight, the Pittsburgh Foundation. I'm sorry, I forgot to acknowledge those of you at home. So we know it's a snowy night in Pittsburgh, so in addition to the double our audience of people who registered, we know some people just got cold feet and are watching from home tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge our new and noted program partner whose house we're in tonight, the Carnegie Library. A shout out to Mystery Lovers Bookshop, who's here with additional signed books, signed copies of Children Under Fire. Tonight, yep, they're all signed, someone asked. Tonight, we'll begin our program with John taking the podium to talk about this urgent topic. Then he'll be joined in conversation with three community leaders, Dr. Paul Abernathy, Julius Boatwright, and Valerie Dixon. After that, he's really interested and happy to take your questions. Introducing John Woodrow Cox and tonight's panelists, on behalf of the Pittsburgh Foundation, is President and CEO Lisa Schroeder. Shortly into her tenure as president, Lisa directed the foundation's crisis response as COVID-19 strained our region's public health system, shuttered the economy, and illuminated long-standing racial inequities. Under Lisa's leadership, the Foundation's new strategic plan commits the Foundation to realize a region free of inequities in which all residents have opportunities not just to survive, but to thrive. Please welcome Lisa Schroeder. Lisa?
Good evening to all of you who have joined us, and thank you, Stephanie, for that very nice introduction. I want to say at the outset how much we appreciate the partnership with Arts and Lectures, and we also appreciate the many ways in which you foster community learning. At the Pittsburgh Foundation, we know from experience that partners do amazing things when values and missions are aligned. And we're honored to have such wide participation here with us, logged in from all over our region and beyond. So important, because we will need help from all of you to make progress on the issue that brings us here this evening. How shocking to find that gun violence across the United States and here in Allegheny County is nothing less than the nation's top public health epidemic, with consequences that reach far beyond the violent incidents themselves. Over the past 2 years, we witnessed unprecedented collaboration to address the COVID-19 public health crisis, and we've learned that the same level of combining heads and hearts in action will be essential to reducing and preventing gun violence. According to police reports, just covering January through the end of summer this year, there have been 87 gun-related homicides in Allegheny County, 48 in the city of Pittsburgh. Also, for our city in that time period, there have been 96 non-fatal shootings and more than 2,200 shots fired. Included in these numbers are deaths that are part of our story, including the October 15th murders of Betty Jean Averitt, grandmother of 11, and Jackie Christine Mihalik, mother of 4 young children. The women were waiting for a bus on the north side when a shooting occurred at a gas station across the street. A 20-year-old man, John Hornaces, was also killed. Tragically, we could proceed to honor the lives of so many other victims, with each loss forever impacting the lives of countless others. The trauma engulfs loved ones, first responders, their friends, classmates, co-workers, and entire communities. Each shooting that results in homicide or wounds generates trauma that travels outward like a radioactive cloud. In fact, it feels like the word epidemic may be too clinical to fully describe this crisis. We've arrived at a place in time where words cannot capture the depths and the permanence of loss, period. What we will learn more about this evening is how the trauma experienced by children and adolescents in our own community can lead to deep emotional and behavioral challenges that last far longer than we may understand. We're grateful to have Reverend Glenn Grayson here with us this evening, who is a member of our foundation's board and who's dedicated his life to this crisis after losing his son, Jerron, to gun violence in 2010. Reverend Grayson runs programs that reduce youth involvement with gun violence through his pastorship of Wesley Center AME Zion Church and his leadership of the Center That Cares. In a Post-Gazette story earlier this summer investigating the sharp increase in shootings, he referred to the situation as a runaway train, and he asked the reporter, "How do we stop a runaway train?" This was his call to action to our entire community. And only a few weeks ago at a press conference following the Northside shooting that I cited, Pittsburgh Mayor Ed Gainey called on all of us to get involved, and I quote, "Only by coming together and making this a priority discussion can we solve this. We need government, yes, but we need community leaders, neighborhood leaders, nonprofit leaders, business leaders, media leaders. Everyone has to be in this because it's the only way we're going to solve it," end quote. He is right. So we set about to offer this speaker series project as a way to convene and to explore solutions. The Pittsburgh Foundation, the University of Pittsburgh's Institute of Politics, and the United Way of Southwestern Pennsylvania are three organizations dedicated to finding nonpartisan solutions for serious regional challenge. And tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Staunton Farm Foundation, and I must say, lovingly orchestrated by our team at the Pittsburgh Foundation. In the face of this crisis, we asked ourselves, how can we help to bring the community together? And so here we are, beginning just that. Where to start? Back in May, when the mass shootings happened in Buffalo, and then just 10 days later in Uvalde, our foundation was working with 3 community foundations serving the Uvalde region in Texas around the emergency response of raising support. And I was feeling despondent, indeed desperate, as I said to my colleagues not to leave anything on the table. I was driving home on my evening commute when I heard John Woodrow Cox in an interview on NPR's All Things Considered. I was riveted. That was my first exposure to the profound insights in his book, especially offering case studies of people from across geographical and ideological boundaries who need empathetic understanding and long-term patient support, not just to prevent tragedy, but to heal trauma in the aftermath. Thank you, John, for emphasizing public health services and support for children as the focal points for accomplishing that. All important is the opportunity this evening to hear from our panelists of dedicated experts, practitioners, and advocates all, for offering on-the-ground experience, expertise, and advocacy that is essential to our understanding. As Stephanie said, we have with us Father Paul Abernathy of the Neighborhood Resilience Project, Julius Boatwright of Steel Smiling and Neighborhood Allies, and Valerie Dixon of PACT and the Center for Victims. Of course, many other remarkable organizations are dedicated to ending gun violence in our communities, and they are listed on the Pittsburgh Foundation website, with many of you represented here this evening. We thank you today and every day. So I'll begin our session on how to derail the runaway train with a brief introduction of John Cox. Since 2014, he has been an enterprise reporter at the Washington Post. His book, Children Under Fire, is based on a series he wrote for the Post about the traumatizing effects of gun violence on children. He was recognized for that work in 2018 as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. John also was part of the team of Post journalists awarded this year's Public Service Pulitzer for coverage of the insurrection of the U.S. Capitol. He has won Scripps Howard's Ernie Pyle Award for Human Interest Storytelling, the Dart Award for Excellence in Coverage of Trauma, and many other honors. He and his wife, Jen, live in suburban Washington, D.C. Great journalism always stems from storytelling that is not just accurate, but that stirs the heart by providing a window into the experience of others, and in this case, particularly the experience of our precious children and young people, that offers vital opportunities for action. This is the gift that John has shared in Children Under Fire, and that he has come to share with us this evening. Please, everyone, welcome John Cox.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and those words. Thank you all for being here on a snowy night. I'm going to start with a short reading from the book, and then I'm going to talk a little bit after that, and then we'll get to our panelists. So. The boy had come to the end of another bad week, and now the girl he adored wanted to know how he was doing. He hated when people thought of him as a troublemaker, one of those kids who frustrated his teachers and disappointed his mother, but more and more often, he feared that's how they all felt. He had struggled to keep buried what was inside him, a swirling, combustible blend of emotion that the tiniest spark could ignite. It had started as disbelief, even denial, before turning into grief, and then at last, the simmering rage that had clung to him for months. It had erupted again a few days prior, so the true answer to the girl's question would have been that he wasn't doing well. But the boy didn't want her to know the truth. Good, Tyshawn McFadder, age 9, told her instead as he stared through the screen of his mother's cell phone at Ava Olson, age 8. It was, for late spring, an unusually brisk afternoon in his neighborhood, just 15 minutes from the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Dressed in black sweatpants and a gray hoodie pulled low over his head, Tyshawn stood barefoot as he slumped over the side of an armchair in his mother's modest living room, the cell phone in one hand and a chocolate chip granola bar in the other. Ava, who was 520 miles away in South Carolina that afternoon, told him her week had been hard. Why, he asked. I've just been mad and sad and stuff, said Ava, her hair honey blonde, brown eyes serious, and accent tinged with the South. She wore a blue t-shirt and pink SpongeBob SquarePants bottoms as she sat atop her bed beside a half-dozen stuffed animals and a fat brown cat named Charlie. Why? Tyshawn repeated between bites of the granola bar. Ava didn't know what to say. She also didn't want her friend to know the truth, both because it pained her to discuss it and because she dreaded what he might think of her if he knew. For 7 seconds, she didn't answer. I don't know, just, she said, and stopped and changed the subject. Ava had first heard about Tyshawn nearly a year earlier, when she walked into her living room and noticed her mother, Mary, crying on the couch. Why are you upset? Asked Ava, who suspected that, yet again, she was why. No, Mary assured the girl, it wasn't her fault. Her mother explained that she had just read a story I'd written for the Washington Post about a child named Tyshawn who was a lot like Ava. The boy also felt angry and confused and unhappy sometimes because he too had lost someone he loved. His dad is where Jacob is, Mary said, and Ava understood. Mary hadn't let her read my story, but she showed her daughter pictures of Tyshawn, posing next to his dad and flashing the deuces sign in a family photo, playing with a toy alone on his father's couch, staring out a window, his dark eyes empty. The boy looked like he needed a friend, Ava announced, so she got a pencil and a sheet of paper and sat down at her kitchen table. Dear Tyshawn, she began to write in neat block letters. Before their lives came apart, the two kids had little in common, other than their ages. Ava, who was white, was a Daisy Scout and wanted nothing more than to become a cheerleader. Day after day, she practiced cartwheels in the dirt and grass behind her home, which overlooked a neighbor's bucolic horse farm. She had lived almost all her life in Townville, a quiet 4,000-person swath of countryside on the northwest corner of South Carolina known as the Upstate. Her dad had always worked in security or law enforcement, and he'd always carried a gun, which she never thought much about, if at all. In a community with a single stoplight, at least 6 churches, and an abundance of backyard shooting ranges, most people believed in God and, just slightly less, in their right to bear arms. Townville sat on the eastern edge of a county in which 7 in 10 voters supported Donald Trump in 2016. Gable-roofed chicken houses stood among cow pastures and rolling fields of hay, wheat, corn, and soybeans, and everyone shopped at Dollar General, nicknamed the Townville Target. It was a world that, in Ava's mind, had always been safe and always would be. That changed one afternoon in late September 2016 when she walked outside her school for recess just as a teenager drove up to the playground in a Dodge Ram, jumped out of the pickup, and pointed a gun. One of the bullets he fired struck 6-year-old Jacob Hall, a classmate whom Ava loved dearly. 3 days later, Jacob died. She was so overwhelmed by the loss and the terror of what she'd witnessed that a pediatrician later diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder and recommended that the girl be homeschooled. Ava, who was prescribed both antipsychotics and antidepressants, began hitting herself and yanking out her eyelashes. In the months that followed, she detailed her torment in journals. "I can't stop feeling mad. No one ever listens to me. I hate guns." By then, Tyshawn, who was black, had known since as far back as his memory stretched about the bad things people could do with guns. On his dad's dresser in southeast Washington was a reminder, a 3-inch button inscribed with "Rest in Peace" that honored a family friend shot 2 blocks away. Tyshawn was growing up in a time of rapid gentrification across the 700,000-person city, but the change had yet to reach his side of the Anacostia River. More than half the district's homicides occurred, and nearly every other child grew up in poverty. It was amid this chaos that the boy lived part-time with his father, Andrew McFadder, in a row of 70-year-old duplexes around the corner from a liquor store. The vast majority of his overwhelmingly black section of the city rejected Trump in 2016, as did the rest of Washington, which cast just 1 in 25 votes for him. Parents in Tyshawn's neighborhood viewed firearms less like sacred objects than like carriers of an infectious disease, but they were everywhere, despite the district's strict gun laws, thanks to the demand from drug dealers and gang members, and a supply from surrounding states with much looser laws. The impact was perpetually devastating on the community, where many boys and girls learned to navigate peril before they learned to read. For kids in Tyshawn's neighborhood, the unrelenting threat of gun violence informed almost every aspect of their lives. The streets they walked down, the parks they visited, the pictures they drew, the nightmares they had, the number of parents they came home to. Tyshawn's mom, Donna Johnson, had fretted since he was born about how that environment would affect her son. So she decided that the best way to keep him safe was to keep him busy. He made s'mores at Cub Scout gatherings and took lessons for hockey, swimming, and software coding. He liked football and decided at a wiry 4'4" that he would play linebacker in the NFL for his hometown team when he grew up. Donna, a 30-year-old State Department security officer, was desperate to protect his goofy innocence, the quality that led him once to secretly record himself rapping an original song she discovered later. "What are those on your toes? They can't be Doritos," he rhymed, then nodded to the camera, feeling good about his track. "That's the new one," he said. She struggled to preserve that piece of her boy, who had both a deep well of compassion for people he sensed were suffering, and a tendency to explode in anger, often with his fists, when he was being teased or challenged. "I just want him to be different," Donna would say, because she had already seen too many tough young boys who, when they turned into tough young men, ended up in prisons or caskets. By age 7, Tyshawn had narrowly escaped harm from gunfire twice, and 3 of his father's friends had already been killed. Then came that week in early 2017 when, over 7 days, 6 people were shot on a single street that ran through their neighborhood. The last of them, and the only one who didn't survive, was Tyshawn's father. The loss unmoored Tyshawn, whose dad was also his best friend. They were twins, said people who knew Andrew as a boy before the dreadlocks. Same chocolate eyes, strong chin, quiet smile. Andrew was the fun parent, the one who stayed up with Tyshawn well past his bedtime playing the violent video games Donna didn't like. But Andrew was also the parent who, while Donna worked, attended parent-teacher meetings and seldom missed a school performance or ball game. As the weeks passed and the signs of the boy's sorrow waned, his fear and fury bloomed. At home, he began to talk less of the things he missed about his dad and more about the man who'd killed him, and whether he'd come after Tyshawn too. At school, he shoved a boy who he suspected had laughed about the shooting, later threatening to punch another who he thought had done the same. One day, after a long stretch of quiet during a drive home, he told his mom he wanted to die so he could be with his dad again. Tyshawn McFadder did not get shot, and neither did Ava Olson. Their small bodies bear none of the grisly physical wounds that our nation assumes to be the direst consequence of gun violence. But the damage that bullets did to both of them was immense. Their experiences as young Americans were not in any way unique, though. Every moment of every day, gunfire reshapes our kids' lives because of whom it takes away or what it makes them witness, or how it forever changes their view of the world. And time after time, the people who loved them wondered the same thing that the people who loved Tyshawn and Ava wondered about them. Would these children ever recover? So I'm going to pause there and offer some context. Much of my work over the last almost 6 years has been devoted to children who are not physically harmed, who are not wounded by gunfire. That is the way that most Americans process gun violence. So there was a shooting at the University of Virginia, and most people probably know that 3 people died there. But they don't know how many people were in that garage or on that bus, or how many loved ones were left without a son or a sibling. To put these two in context, this is really where my journey began, with these 2 kids, with Tyshawn and Ava. They were epiphanies. Meeting both of them, for me, was so enlightening because I realized that we were looking at this too narrowly as a country. We were not realizing that this is not a problem that affects thousands. It's a problem that affects literally millions of children. After I met Ava and came back, and I realized that there were hundreds of kids at that school who weren't shot, but whose lives were forever changed, I started a database to try to figure out how many children had been on campuses since Columbine when a school shooting occurred. That number is now over 320,000. That doesn't include sports games, that doesn't include anything before or after school. That is children who've been at a school when a school shooting occurred. A meaningful number of those kids are forever changed. Tyshawn launched me on another endeavor to try to put him in context. How does he fit into our society? At least 41 children a day lose a parent to gun violence in America. That doesn't count suicides. It is just strictly someone shooting someone else. At least 41 kids a day are just like Tyshawn. So to address this problem, we have to acknowledge the scope. We have to stop looking at it like the headline that says X number shot, and then we move on. Because that's really how we calculate how much we care about a shooting in this country, is how many people died. No one remembers Ava's shooting, that no one remembers the Townville school shooting because one child died. Everybody in this room remembers Sandy Hook. We all remember Uvalde. We all remember Parkland. But the level of devastation these kids go through is immense, even when there is just one death. So that's a lot, but the truth is, as somebody who keeps doing this, I'm not doing it just because of that, because I'm trying to enlighten people on the scope of this. It's also because I see hope, and no one is closer to this issue than I am, except maybe some people in this room who are doing similar sorts of work. So the next part of our conversation is going to be about that, about solutions. Because it is not hopeless. I tell people all the time, we're never going to go from 45,000 people dead from gun violence in America to 0. We won't. But that can't be the goal. It can't be the goal. Success cannot be measured in this sort of binary way that we often so look at gun violence. If we get that number to 40,000 or 35,000 or 30,000 or 25, that's worth it. So I'm now going to ask the panelists to join me, and we're going to talk about how we can do that. Thank you. Julius, I'm going to start with you. So we know that for kids to recover, it's something that I cite all the time, is that the number one reason that kids get over trauma is having one adult in their life who loves them. We know that the data shows us that. So this is an area you've worked on for a long time. And so I want to ask you, what do we need, the support needed for adults, if you could talk about that. And also if you could talk about the emotional and behavioral skills that those adults need, and specifically what's going on in Pittsburgh to supply those adults with that that support and those skills that they need to then help these children?
Yes, thank you for that question. I will just invite everyone in the room to just take a deep breath. We're talking about a very heavy subject matter, so just to be able to ground ourselves in this space, so I invite you to do that. Feel better? So I really appreciate that question, and I want to share just a quick piece of context on my what drew me to the work and what really called me to the work. I had a dear friend of mine that after we went to school at the University of Pittsburgh together, died by suicide. So that is my connection to a different type of gun violence, if you will. Not to say that they're all equally as important and deserve equal amounts of attention. Just want to give a little bit of context into why I am so passionate and just deeply care about this matter. So I think of three things when I think of adults, right? And what we can do for ourselves and what we can do for each other when it comes to combating this epidemic that we're facing. I think of safe attachment. So when we think about adults and the relationships that we have with kiddos and young people in our lives, they need to be able to feel safe in our presence, right? And that takes a lot of intentionality, a lot of compassion, and a great deal of empathy for a child or a young person to come to us and say they're in need of something mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and then us as adults having the ability and the care and the compassion to really help them create that safe attachment. Because if we don't do that in those early years, what happens when our youth grow up? They're still searching for those safe attachments, right? They're still searching for those relationships that can make them whole and make them feel loved and valued and appreciated. So it's so important, it's pertinent, it's crucial for us as adults to be able to form those safe attachments with our kiddos and our young people. The second thing I will say is, what are we doing as adults to build our skills to be able to provide some level of mental and emotional support to the young people in our lives? So I'm not saying that we all need to become psychiatrists or psychologists or therapists. I'm not recommending that, but just being able to have some sort of baseline set of skills, whether it's being trained in mental health first aid, knowing the basics of active listening, because now what you have and what we have as adults is a toolbox that we can go into, right? When a young person comes to us or when they don't come to us, when we get that sense that something's just not right with Tim or Samantha or Bobby, something is not right with them. And I feel confident because of the skills that I have as an adult to open up and hold space for that conversation with whatever age range that young person might be, right? So being able to build those skills and be intentional about doing that no matter what walk of life we're from. Because some folks may say, well, I'm in this line of profession, so I don't need those skills. I would argue that everyone in this space needs it, and every adult in general needs some level of baseline skills on how to be able to support the mental, emotional, and behavioral needs of our kids. And the last piece for me is very important right now because I just finished a yoga teacher training program, and I've been getting on this like soapbox about yoga as of late. So it's the self-care piece, but not in the sense of like the bubble bath, like candle self-care, meaning that we as adults are dealing with a lot of vicarious trauma. We're carrying a lot of our own PTSD. We are still trying to navigate multiple pandemics, and we are stressed and anxious and just trying our best to show up. And what ends up happening is if we're not working on our own healing, our own personal wellness, that manifests itself in the relationships and the way that we communicate with our partners, with the kiddos in our lives, right? So we could be running youth programming and holding space for kids to come in and have a safe space and they can feel our energy. They can actually feel when we're stressed and we're anxious, right? So it's one thing to hold that space and create these safe environments. It's another thing to take care of ourselves and ensure that we are whole. So we are also modeling what does it look like to be a whole, healthy, well human being to the young people in our lives as well. So I'll pause because I can talk the entire time. So let me just.
I could listen to you
Quiet.
keep talking. You know, that called to mind, just I'll very quickly share this about the self-care piece that I think we overlook so often with teachers and parents. I remember talking to a principal in Southeast DC whose school, this is an elementary school, who'd gone through a series of lockdowns, not lockdown drills, but actual shootings in the neighborhood, and kids were repeatedly, this was in the span of just a few weeks, had repeatedly been forced to shut the lights off, hide in the corner, not knowing if there was a gunman on their campus. And what she suddenly realized is they were having all these sort of treatments and support for the kids, and they had nothing for the teachers. And she found that the teachers were snapping at the kids, that they couldn't sort of deal with their own trauma because there was no support for them. And she realized, wait a minute, I need to give them a break. And I think so often we are so hyper-focused on supporting these kids that we're not understanding that the people who are on the front lines need that support too. So, Valerie, you've done this work for 20 years, dealing with families, supporting families that have been impacted by gun violence. And we talk a lot about resilience and moving on. I wonder specifically, in your experience, what you have seen works in terms of healing. What actually helps families heal who have been impacted by gun violence?
Thank you, John, and it's an honor to be up here with you as well, too. What I wanted to share, how I came to the work, as you mentioned, 21 years ago, June 25th, 2001, my son Rob Dixon was murdered. And in the interim of him being murdered, he was 2 weeks away from going to practice with the Atlanta Falcons, their little summer camp program they had. And within a week, 2 more of his friends were murdered. And then within 5 weeks of that, 2 more of his friends were murdered. So in the trauma that I experienced, I always knew that I'm going to have to find a way to live my life without him. And how do I do that? Because there's no way you could reverse it. But how do we figure out? And how do you figure out these kids that have shot and killed each other were the same kids that used to walk to Head Start? And when my son would come home and say, so-and-so shot such and such, I'm like, why? How? Where'd they get the gun from? They were best friends. I never understood how that could actually be possible until I started to dive more and more into it. So it wasn't a career for me to go into. I was doing something totally different, and my life took a U-turn. So, I started working with the Center for Victims, and I started in juvenile court. And I was 110% victim advocate. But as I seen that youth come in that was accused of the crime with shackles on and the sheriff pushing them to a chair, I said, how do we stop that? How do we stop that? And then I was there for 5.5 years. I had such an opportunity working with the Center for Victims to be able to network and be on different committees and boards and travel throughout the city and state so I could learn more about this line of work. I had no idea of the depth of it. And what drove me further into that, I started doing criminal court advocacy, and I did homicides mostly. So those are ones that actually had arrests, but there were families that didn't have arrests, didn't have answers, and they were just lost in the wilderness. There was no connection, no contact, and these were the collateral damages that are left in our community. And the numbers grew and grew and grew, and these are the family members that are having children from that trauma, unaddressed, unresolved trauma. And the kids are actually pulling on that unaddressed, unresolved trauma. And then you have another generation under that one. And then you have these layers of compound complex trauma. And how do we address our community? Because we focus on the youth, but where did they come from? Who was their support system that needs support as well too? And so how do we engage those families and let them know that the word therapy or counseling is not taboo? We all have mental health. To some level, we have to address the communities that we live in that have the most impact of this violence that made everyone numb. And so through the years, I know in the work that I've done, I went to therapy right after my son died. And my first 4 sessions, I just cried the whole hour. And they was like, oh, your hour's up, okay. And back out the door. And I said, I can't do this. And there was something, I sat on my couch one day, and I used to watch ER and all those things like that before it happened. Those are some of my favorite movies, still are. I used to watch First 48 and all this stuff. It's just human behavior is astonishing to me. But I sat there one day, and I actually heard a voice. I was in the room by myself, and it said, don't let those 4 bullets kill you too. And that was my motivating factor. I heard it as clear as day, and I knew who it was. I knew who it was. And so once I got up, there was a voice, because first we were trying to find out who killed my son. That was most important. I didn't think the voice was loud enough, going around the community, asking people. I started developing flyers, not loud enough. So I was at work, and I designed just a billboard. Mothers came to me and said, my daughter's case is still open too. Really? I had no idea my son's case was not going to be solved. That didn't even cross my mind. But there were families that were out there for years, didn't know who killed their loved one. I couldn't imagine living that life either. And so I designed this billboard, and I went to the billboard company, and I didn't have a dime. And I told them what I wanted to do. And they said, we love your concept. We'll do billboards for you for free. So I started posting unsolved homicide cases in the communities with the permission of the families and their faces of their loved ones of where the crime happened or where the family felt would be more impactful. And then I went to law enforcement to say, would it be feasible for me to put this up now? Sometimes they might have a hot tip. I don't want to have somebody ran out of town because they see that billboard. So I start collaborating with the police officers. And I went to the district attorney's office. I said, hey, you got this pool of money of confiscated funds. Could I use some of that as reward money? So the money you took off of some of the people, or the drug dealers or the killers or whatever it might be, can I use that same money to get their friends in jail as a reward? He said, yeah. We started out with $1,000, then $3,000, and went to $5,000. And so we started posting those billboards up, and families started coming out of the woodwork. But I noticed families, even though they didn't get a resolve from the billboard campaign, because I would highlight it and have a press conference for them and everything to let them know somebody do care. Then they wanted to start to get involved. They start coming out of the darkness and said, my story can help another kid. I'm ready to help another family member. And what I've seen that has helped me through these years is those that have been impacted by the crime and violence want to help others, but need the opportunity for that. They need resources to help support that, because there's nothing stronger than the voice of those that have actually been impacted, as you know, and as compelling as your book has shared the stories of individuals, and just bringing it home to people that seem so far removed of it. But to hear that story and have the compassion of someone that, this has never happened in my community, but just hearing your story, I want to help you. I want to get involved. How can we do that? And so I've noticed throughout the years that collaboration was the key. Just 2 people, you could be from opposite ends of the spectrum, but if you give yourself an opportunity to sit at the table with somebody and hear each other's story, then you could come to some happy medium to say, how can I support you? And how can I support you? And I think that was the key of strengthening me, and that was my therapy. And it continues to be even after 21 years, because as long as I'm living, my son will have been murdered. And I start working with the agencies and organizations and individuals that are like-minded, and those that didn't even realize the power that they have, and just, a helping hand that can elevate somebody to another level. But identifying that you can empower people within their own communities, and they don't have to come out of their area and their community, go to a whole nother community, to try to get the help that they need. Let's provide the resources in the areas that they live, so they're more comfortable and they're identifying with people that they know or from their community. They have experienced it, but are on a road to some type of wellness or healing, from the tragedy. And then it starts to become a conversation, let's be proactive, because a lot of the engagement is reactive. And so now we see people that come to us because something has happened already, it's after event, but how do we identify being proactive? And that's how we start connecting with organizations that or focused on being proactive and interactive. And, you know, I just want to acknowledge Reverend Grayson and his Center That Cares and the REACH program, because that was another outlet to be able to reach families prior to or in their midst of. And they are seeing people that look like them, that maybe even lived a lifestyle one time, to turn their life totally around, but they're connected still to their community, and they can help guide them and lead them and their family members to a better decision making, better choices, and make sure those resources are out there for them.
I have one quick follow-up. What is the most essential resource when you're trying to break through making somebody feel seen and cared for and loved? You talked about resources. I mean, what is, if you had to name sort of one thing that you found to be most important, what would that be?
What I really think would be most important is being available. Just being there for some people. Sometimes you don't even have to talk, but you know you're coming there to actually help somebody and let them talk. They'll tell you what they need. You can't go and tell them this is what you need. They'll tell you what you need. And then it's your job to be connected with or collaborating with or can identify an agency or resource, a commitment that's out there to say, I know exactly how to get what you need, and I'm going to help you do that. That's all some people know. Even if you can tell them, I don't know, but I will find out for you. It means so much to people. Or there's nothing out there like that. Why don't your voice help me try to get what is needed? That unmet need that's not available, let your voice be loud enough to tell them, here's an unmet need out here in the community, and let it be loud enough so these resources can say, I keep hearing this coming our way. We need to try to find a way to fulfill that unmet need that this community say that they need. Because the community will tell you what you need. You can't go to the community and tell them this is what you need.
That's a good transition to Father Paul, because I want to ask you about need as well. What you see as the biggest needs, and having worked with people impacted, families impacted by gun violence for a long time, and then also more broadly, what we can do societally. So at the city level, the county level, the state level, the national level. I mean, there's layers to this, right? So if you could talk about those two things.
Yes, and John, let me say it's an honor to be here with you. Your book is absolutely riveting. It's one of the more important works that's been done, I believe, in our generation. As Americans, I can say that, so thank you. This is an important question. As I sit and I listen to this question about trauma, and so often we do focus, rightly so, on how we're helping our communities heal from trauma, how we're helping survivors heal from trauma. I'm reminded of a conversation I had. Actually, it was a panel I was sitting on in Penn Hills. Those of us from around here know the area, Penn Hills. And there was a young woman, high school student, whose twin brother had been shot and killed. And we were talking about a similar sort of thing. How do we heal? How do we heal from what's been happening? And she said, in a very frustrated manner, she said, y'all, this is the problem. Y'all keep talking about post-traumatic stress. And to us, it's not post. It is happening every single day. For me, the conversation about healing can't happen if we're also not talking about how we end it. I really appreciate your point, John, about going to zero. We understand we live in a fallen world. As long as there's sin in the world, there's going to be violence. We understand that. And yet, at the same time, it doesn't have to be at the level that it is. We can't talk about healing. We can't talk about healing unless we're also talking about how we're ending this violence. Now, I believe that, like you, John, I believe that we can make an extraordinary difference in this regard. Regarding your question about what really is it the communities need, I think into your second question about systems, we're talking about local, state, federal government, and other community stakeholders. I believe it's a very similar answer to both. One thing that I find quite astonishing is just the lack of planning, the lack of strategy that has really gone into addressing this issue. You raised some very important I believe I won't certainly steal. You need to read the book, so I won't give the ending away. But you do really bring up three very key things that we really need as it relates to gun violence. And I will say that as it pertains to policy, as it pertains to research, as it pertains to education, there are things certainly that we need that are beyond let's say, beyond the control of those of us who are really in community. Although I will say, we are living in a democracy, and I do believe that every voice matters. People can't necessarily advocate for certain things if they're living in crisis. I believe that. People are sometimes living in fear that robs from them the ability to advocate for these measures which you bring up, I believe are very, very important. And at the same time, I do believe that on a community level, working with local, state, and federal government, we can develop these extraordinary strategies, these strategies that we know can greatly reduce violence. We know that there are things like violence interruption that does reduce violence. I will go on to say from that even if we interrupt the violence, unless we address the conditions that are driving that violence, we are missing the point. We know where this violence is concentrated. We know the groups who are perpetrating this violence. If we put the data of the community up on a screen, we will see that it is such a small number of the community that is perpetrating this violence. And we also know that violence is contagious, that those who experience violence, those who survive violence, become more likely to perpetrate that violence. So if we know all of this, I think in my mind, it's why aren't we organizing resources? Why don't we have this strategy, and why don't we be very aggressive in going after this? I don't believe we are to the fullest extent. And I don't believe there is this up to this point. I think we're on the brink of it. But up to this point, we've not seen the level of partnership this requires between community, local, state, and federal government. Recently, we're very excited to see that there are many resources that have been dedicated to confronting violence in our community. And yet, at the same time, what happens when you say we're going to dedicate $100 million to fighting violence in the community, and we need to know what the plan is by next Tuesday? Doesn't seem to me the best way to do that. And I've also seen, even in this process, that when there's city resources, then there's county resources, there's state resources, and federal resources that are often not coordinated, where we see there's this one particular government entity that's offering resources to address gun violence, has no idea that another level of government has offered resources also to address gun violence. It creates confusion and competition, and certainly undermines a cohesive strategy that our communities need. If we want to heal our communities, we've got to really put in place a very robust strategy. To Valerie's point, one of the points that you raise in the book that's so important, meaning making, to find our purpose, people survivors who would find their purpose in working to end this violence. I see it every single day. Now I think we need simply to channel that energy in a very thoughtful and strategic way. And I believe that if we do that, we can make an extraordinary difference.
Amen. That's well said. You know, I think about, we've all talked about resources, right? All the work that all of you are doing, it's not easy and it's not free. You know, I talk about this a lot, that the reality is that if we're going to live in a society that allows children to be slaughtered in their schools and on their street corners, and they're witness daily violence, if we're going to live with that, and we're going to accept that, then we have to say we're going to do something for them. And it is incumbent on all of us to find those resources, and that costs money. That can come from our government. Sometimes that doesn't happen, though, because of politics. Other times that can come from nonprofits. But this work can't be done without people who are invested. It starts with that. I think about a woman who I met and wrote about in Baltimore. I was following a little girl there who'd lost her father to gun violence in 2016, and she lost her mother in 2020. She was orphaned by gun violence. And the city of Baltimore had a grant through the prosecutor's office to have one counselor who specialized in dealing with children who've been impacted by gun violence. Either they'd witnessed it or they had lost a loved one. She worked with this little girl, and she made tangible progress. She actually made progress. She trusted her, and then the grant ran out, and they didn't replace it. This is in Baltimore, a city that has been ravaged by gun violence, and someone made a conscious choice to either not go after the funding, to not replace it. That can't happen. It can't happen. She was working literally with dozens of children in that community and making a tangible difference. So I implore people to not just care, and if you want to do something, people ask me all the time, well, what can I do? What organization can I sign up for? Go at the city level, the state level, the county level, and demand funding. Do that. And then also support nonprofits that are here in this room working on this issue. That's what it takes. It takes resources. It takes people, right? When you talk about being a listening ear, that takes a human being to do that. So, we can talk about this in the theoretical, but this work is hard and it takes investment. So I can't go without saying that. I think we're going to open it up to questions. But thank you all. This was, I would like to offer a round of applause for our panelists. This was so thoughtful.
Thank you all. So if you have a question, we'd like you just to come on up and I'll give you the microphone.
Someone be brave. It's always the hardest question, the first one.
The lights are coming up so you can find your way.
Where do we go from here?
All right.
That's it. That's the question. Where do we go from here?
Ooh, that's a complicated question. I'll say this. So I was in Nashville a couple of weeks ago doing one of these, and one of the sessions I did was with students at a university there. And at one point we asked them, everybody, to raise their hands who'd been through a lockdown. Not a lockdown drill, but an actual lockdown. And almost every one of them raised their hands. They were matter of fact about it. It's just the world that they live in. And one thing I said to them, and I say a lot, is that I don't think that this generation will tolerate their kids going through it. I don't believe that. And in fact, I said this before the midterms that actually sort of gave evidence to that it was an issue of priority. It wasn't just the economy and gas prices. It wasn't just Roe v. Wade. That a lot of people, and a lot of people of that generation, voted based on their experiences with gun violence. So that is what gives me, it's long term, right? I'm talking, when I answer your question, it's 20, 30 years from now maybe. But I think we will see fundamental change on this issue in our lifetimes, because I think these kids who are native, we call them the lockdown generation. We call them the Columbine generation. I don't think they'll tolerate it. I don't. So that is something that gives me hope. Now, I know that doesn't exactly answer probably your question entirely, but I'll open it up. That's my first thought, though, about sort of the long-term where we go, is I think that there will be people, to quickly put that in context, Americans think that we're split on gun violence. We think that we're divided like everything else 50-50. We are not. That is fundamentally untrue. The overwhelming majority of gun owners believe in what is called common sense gun reform. Where we are divided is on Capitol Hill and in state legislators. There are 7 or 8 Americans in the Senate who are deciding for all of us what our gun laws will be. And it just takes a little bit of pressure and a tipping point to change those minds. And then suddenly we have rapid gun reform. And I do think we'll get there. So I'll open it up.
I'll come to you.
What does gun reform look like? I mean, we have more guns than people in this country right now. Those guns aren't going to go away.
So I'll take this unless somebody else wants to jump in. All right. So the 3 things that Father Paul mentioned that are in the book, I'm not an advocate. I'm a reporter, right? So I, having spent years on this subject, found 3 things, obvious things. There are many, many, many more, but 3 obvious things that we could do right away that would make a meaningful difference. One is that gun owners need to lock up their guns. They don't need to, kids don't need to have access to firearms. They don't. If, for many Americans, the only form of gun violence they care about are school shootings. That's it. They do not care about suicides. They don't care about black and brown children being affected by by guns, they care about school shootings. So what I say to those people is if that is the only thing you care about, if the one change we had made as a country after Columbine was to lock up our firearms, nearly 60% of school shootings would not have happened. They just would have disappeared. That is true still today. If gun owners locked up their guns and kids didn't have access to them, nearly 60% of school shootings would just end. And hundreds of children who take their own lives wouldn't. Many children who accidentally shoot themselves or someone else wouldn't do that. It's an obvious thing that most gun owners, when you put it in that context, agree. But they have been convinced that you can educate a child out of making a bad choice with a gun, and that is fundamentally untrue. You can't do it. You can't do it. That is an obvious thing. Something like universal background checks. We know that that would put a real dent in the black market. You know, people say that, oh, look at Washington, D.C. or Chicago. They have strict gun laws, and they have gun violence. That must mean the gun laws don't work. Well, we don't have closed borders in America. So when you drive over to Virginia and you go to a gun show and you buy 300 guns, or you use straw purchasers, and you drive back over the border into D.C., no one's checking your trunk, right? So, but we know that universal background checks would make a meaningful difference. And the last thing that I recommend is we have to research this. We went more than 25 years in this country without researching gun violence because of politics. In the mid-1990s, one congressman said, added an amendment to the budget that effectively disallowed the CDC from studying gun violence. So in the same way that we've made progress on car safety, the reason we have airbags, the reason we have barriers on highways is because people researched that and they realized if we do this, we'll save this many lives. We could do that exact same thing with gun violence. But because of politics, we haven't. Now, just in the last 3 or 4 years, we've started funding that again. But we can't answer the question if we don't even try to find the answer.
Thank you. I'm going to come over here.
Thank you all so much for being here this evening. My question relates to, you've talked a bit about sort of the top-down recommendations, the policy recommendations. What about in your travels, in your experience, have you seen from the community level up about what we should be thinking about as what we can do as community members to begin to address some of the gun violence in our community?
Well, I think a lot of what we talked about tonight, right? I mean, the people who are on the front lines, the 3 people next to me on this stage, need support, you know, and that can come in a lot of different ways. That can come in people volunteering and saying, I'll give my time. It can also be people writing checks. You know, there are a lot of, because I'm not an advocate, I never tell people to join organizations that are working on this issue, but, you know, we talk a lot about Sandy Hook and how that didn't lead to federal legislation, but it did launch the 1,000 Ships, right? The Moms Demand didn't exist before that, Giffords didn't exist before that. There are a lot of groups that have started to work on this, and there are a lot of local organizations that preceded that because they were dealing with chronic gun violence well before Sandy Hook. So, you know, I'd like to, that's a question I'd like some of the panelists next to me to also address because they're in the thick of it here. Well, I think that's one thing that Father Paul touched on that I so appreciate is this lack of organization, right? Even if the number of stakeholders in this room, people have to talk to each other, right? Because people are all working toward the same goals. There needs to be community leadership that brings people in the room, as we were doing tonight. This is a function of it, right? But I would like everybody else to chime in on that, because that is an essential question.
What I would say about it is certainly as it pertains to gun violence at the community level, it requires a community effort. The challenge, having said that, is that many of our communities have been so inundated with violence and trauma in general. So I want to talk about community trauma. This isn't just gun violence, but we could talk about the going back even in our, for example, the African American community. Here we can go back to the institution of slavery, the unresolved trauma as a result of that. So we can talk about generation after generation suffering this trauma. What begins to happen if really we understand the context of community, if it really is community that has to address this issue, it's also important to understand that gun violence shatters a sense of community. Now, there might be a time when a neighbor moves onto a block and people think, well, this is really nice. We've got to go meet the new neighbor. Now, I will tell you, if you have a situation on your block where, or in your neighborhood where houses are shot up, when you get a new neighbor, perhaps you raise an eyebrow. Perhaps people might not be so quick to welcome them to the neighborhood. Perhaps the sense is, who are they and what are they going to bring to my street? This is a shattered assumptive worldview that is the result of trauma. So people say, what is the community going to do about this? Sometimes I think if we take really a definition of community and an understanding of community, and we talk about how our community has been so ravaged by violence, sometimes I think, what community really is there? So we have to start, what I believe, is with trauma-informed community building. We have people who are expert organizers. And I think one of the challenges is that we've trained so many people as a Saul Alinsky-style organizers that it becomes simply about achieving a political objective. What I've learned working in community is that we need a different understanding of organizing, a trauma-informed understanding of organizing where we understand the result of this is going to be a culture of health and well-being. We have a culture that in many of us have in our communities a culture that's informed first and foremost by trauma. I'm telling you. We have a culture resulting in cultural norms that reinforce negative behaviors. People say you got to get these young boys to put their guns down. John, you allude to this in your book about a gun culture. You got to get the Texans to put their gun down. The only difference is, I truly believe, I don't think the people, the young folks carrying guns in our community are doing so because they believe the Second Amendment gave them that right. I think that's a fundamental difference. I think there's a different cultural reality to them carrying guns, but it is a cultural norm nonetheless. We've got to address that and understand that and replace that culture of trauma to a culture of health and well-being. We need organizers who have a trauma-informed background who are trained to do this. I believe that if we begin with trauma-informed community building, we will begin to have the kind of relationships in place on a community level that will enable us to begin to engage this issue at a more systems level, at a more regional level, because let's face it, when violence happens in one neighborhood, quite often it involves another neighborhood. So we need to address this on a regional level. If we lack, however, that healthy community core, it will be difficult for us to do so. So I believe trauma-informed community building is a necessary component of it all.
I look at it as, one of my colleagues at work always call it urban trauma. And it's different than when someone says, okay, why don't you, you're dealing with some trauma, why don't you go to your EAP program at work and see if you could get a little help, and, that is not even gonna assist this family or the individual that even was referred to go to that type of therapy. We need more therapists that look like the communities that they're working in. There is a level of trust. There's some great programs that are out here, but there's a trust issue that has evolved throughout generations, that you're not going to come in our community, tell us what to do, and you go back to your white picket fence and your mansion and two-car garage. And so how do we have more therapists that look like us or partner with other therapists that don't look like us, but build a trust of continuity? Because when you show up, when you're consistent, that's what starts to open the door for services to be utilized. But the trust is so tight, that's all. When people are in trauma, they just live in that protective mode of their mind. So everything is a threat just coming their way. They're on guard all time, so you're not getting in. So how do you try to lift that barrier there before you can actually get in to start have the conversations that this is what we have. Now let's have a conversation where you feel trusting enough to me to tell me what you need. And then we can work on trying to get that, because there's issue with all the different systems that come in, and like Mr. Cox just mentioned, a program comes in, and after 2 years, when that kid got so much and did so well, then the train just keeps on moving, and that kid reverts. I recall my son in the community we lived in, he went to get some therapy. He was at that age, that 14, 15, resilient, type of, and so we went to get some therapy. And he really enjoyed this guy he was working with. But he got back home, and one of his friends said, "Man, where you be going every week?" He said, "Oh, I be going over to this building in Oakley." "Oh, what building is that?" So he told him what building. He said, "That's a crazy building." My son come in the house, bust in the door. "Mom, where's that place you be taking me to?" And he went off on me. "I'm never going there again." And it was a stigma that he got. He was doing so well with it. But, I know what I love now is that mental health is becoming a regular conversation now. I like that the athletes and those people that are high profile are talking about the mental health issues that they deal with. We see the highlights of, their accolades, and all this time they were struggling mentally, and no one ever seen that. They just seen it, wow, they're amazing. They won the Olympics, they're great. But they was fighting and struggling with mental health. And now you can even get it online, different things like that. How could we provide services to say, if you don't want to, because now a lot of people are getting services at home. So let them get their therapy at home. They don't have to go nowhere and be exposed if they're embarrassed about that. So how do we provide services for that, or an avenue where people are funding that? To say, hey, you need some therapy, we can do that. You want to do it at home? We could do some online therapy if you need it, for you and your family. Because our focus be on the kids, but the kids, the apple don't fall too far from the tree. They got everything they got from their parent, and that parent from that parent. And so it's a family that we have to address, and not the individual juvenile.
I love words. So when I think about just violence prevention, I went and I pulled out, well, I didn't pull out anything. I went onto Google. I didn't pull out an actual book, but the opposite of violence prevention, like peace promotion. And I sat with that for a minute, right? I'm like, what does that actually mean? Like, what would that look like in practice and scaled and operationalized, right? And Father Paul talks about a culture shift, right? It starts with language. It starts with valuing someone's life, even if they're not my neighbor, even if they're not on my street, even if they vote differently than I vote, right? We tend to value people's lives when it hits really close to home, and or when it is a horrific tragedy, right? So just thinking about what would it take to really promote a culture of peace. And I know that, that sounds like rose-colored glasses. It sounds like it's just very sort of pie in the sky. But what I would imagine and envision is a community and spaces and households where kids are meditating with their parents and their grandparents. Maybe the kiddos are actually leading the meditation and deep breathing, where families are actually talking about mental health at the kitchen table, right? And talking about the positive benefits of it. So we are uplifting this mentality of peace and of hope and of love, really. I was sitting here and I was like, Julius, don't say that. That's right, you can't operationalize love. I disagree with that, though. I disagree with it. I think we oftentimes, right, you pull out your phone, and I will speak for myself, right? I don't watch the videos anymore that circulate when people are brutally murdered. I don't watch them. It is too traumatizing to watch. With that, though, I know for me that the every time that happens, I run the risk of becoming less and less connected to the reality of that another human being just lost their life, right? So how do we create these spaces and really own this wellness mindset, this peace culture, and get upstream, right? We're really good, particularly in the U.S., about being downstream. You know, we throw all kinds of money at the downstream stuff, right? And we always show up and we say, well, I'm so sorry that happened. And there's so much value in that. I'm saying it's a both and, right? It's not an either or. It's that. We want to be downstream. We want to be middle of the stream. And how do we get a little bit further upstream so that, to Father Paul's point, when somebody does move in on your block and you see them, how are you approaching them with love and with peace so that they know that they're welcomed and that you are invested in creating a safe community and you value the safety of your neighbors and their livelihood. You value them as a human being. So let's operationalize love, y'all.
Thank you all. We have one more question.
You started off your presentation this evening speaking about the two children that so intrigued you that they set you on this course. During that time, were any of the schools that these children attended, were the schools involved in helping with their trauma? Because I think the schools are one piece of that puzzle as well.
That's a great question. They're a huge piece. They're essential. You know, I'm of the belief that we talk about trauma-informed care. You know, teachers desperately need trauma-informed training. Not to give teachers one more thing, but in my experience, they want that. So Tyshawn's teacher's a great example. I met him when he was in second grade, just a couple of days after his father was killed, and spent pretty much every day with him after that. And you know, I sat next to him at his dad's funeral and went back to him on his first day of school. And his teacher, you know, this was a school, it was a charter school that was planted in a violent neighborhood of Southeast DC, specifically to reach kids like Tyshawn. And I asked his teacher later, a really bright woman in her mid-20s, if she'd been given any kind of trauma training, and she had none. And you know, this was the epiphany moment for me with Tyshawn, and this subject in general was after this stretch of shootings that ended with his father being killed. It was this one neighborhood, there was half a dozen shootings in a week. And they asked their students, who only went up to third grade, this was an elementary school, what makes you sad in your neighborhood? And they asked them to draw pictures. And I remember standing in the auditorium of this school, and there was a panel where they had put all these drawings, and these were kids who were 6, 7, 8 years old. These were drawings in marker and crayon of violent scenes, of people being shot to death, of blood on the ground, of funerals, of gravestones. These weren't imagined things. They weren't imagined, right? These were lived experiences. And, you know, that's who these teachers, right, that's who they were dealing with every day. And kids who would come in and have huge outbursts and would get suspended or expelled. And, you know, that's the shift we have to make, right? I love the language around trauma-informed, is that it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you, right? That is collectively what we all need to be asking. And two, an extension of that, and this is just the truth, there are children in this country who most people have decided that is just the way it is for them. That's just the world they grew up in, and we know it because the way we react to school shootings in white communities versus the way we react to the same number of kids being shot in a weekend in black communities. But there is I don't think everybody even knows that they're doing this, but collectively, societally, we do not value those kids' lives the same way, and we have to reject that. We have to say that kid's life is valued the same as everybody else's. I will say one last thing, since we're on our last question. I'm going to repeat something I said earlier when we talk about what we can do at the community level. You know, the ACEs studies tell us that the most important thing for a kid to get over it, to overcome their trauma, to heal, to have a good life, is one adult in their life who loves them. And that can be anybody in the room, right? That can be anybody. So when we think about what we can do, you can be the one adult. It doesn't have to be. The studies show us, the data tells us, You don't have to be a teacher. You don't have to be a parent, grandparent. You don't have to be blood. You can be anybody who that kid knows that they love. And it begins with this idea of feeling safe, right? Of that it's the hierarchy of needs. Kids need to feel safe and they need to feel loved. And that can make all the difference. So I'll end with that hopeful note.
Thank you. Let's hear it for them. Thank you all for coming. Be safe going home. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you, Stutton Farms. Thank you, Pittsburgh Foundation.